A classical Renaissance presents a collection of paintings belonging not so much to the modern or postmodern art world as to an ancient tradition, flouting the rule of the painter of modern life, of Edouard Manet and Honoré Daumier, that an artist must be of his time. My paintings follow another rule of art, which was taught in the old academies and held sway for hundreds of years before their demise in the early 20th century. Not to appear out of date, one of the recommendations that I received from a committee member at the Copley Society of Art, where this exhibition first appeared in the fall of 2022, was to include something more contemporary, to which I was tempted to reply that everything I do is timeless, though the committee member made a fair point. The significance of academic art is not self-explanatory anymore. And so allow me to explain what it is that I do and why it matters. The story behind this body of work began more than 10 years ago in 2009, when I graduated from art school. I received my training in drawing and painting in the birthplace of the Italian Renaissance, at a school in Florence called the Angel Academy, just blocks away from the original Academy of Painting and Sculpture founded by Giorgio Vasari in 1563. The Angel Academy is part of the Atelier movement, which also includes the Florence Academy, the Grand Central Atelier in New York City, and the Academy of Realist Art in Boston, among many others. The ateliers have done a wonderful job of training a whole generation of painters in a skill set which for much of the 20th century was all but lost, thanks to the abandonment of fine craftsmanship by modern and postmodern artists. Initially, the new academicism was called classical realism, which is a passable description of academic art, though this name has waned in popularity in recent years. My work is very classical, but most of the work being produced by other artists in the movement is not, and not all of it can be described as realism either. After a mere 2 decades, our work has already become too diverse to be easily classified as a particular school or style. The academic tradition has always fostered a great diversity of styles, ranging from Mannerism in the 16th century to Bolognese classicism and Caravagism in the 17th century, to the Rococo and Neoclassicism in the 18th century, though there was always a unifying thread connecting the diverse schools and styles of academic art. From the Accademia in Florence, to the French Academy in Paris, to the Royal Academy in London, there was a common idea of art, first articulated in antiquity and reiterated by theorists of the Renaissance. From the publication of the first Renaissance treatise on painting by Leon Battista Alberti in 1435 until the arrival of Romanticism in the late 18th century, it was taken for granted that the art of painting had a certain nature, which was succinctly expressed by simple theoretical principles, and which was the same everywhere and for all times. Painting was an imitation of nature, and its end was beauty. This nature was given unique expression, but not fundamentally changed by the idiosyncrasies of an artist's style or of a given school. The idea of classical mimesis, that art should be beautiful and imitate nature, is not common sense anymore, as it was for the Italian Renaissance or to the ancient Greeks and Romans, who had the luxury of taking for granted certain assumptions which have since been called into doubt, beginning with belief in God. The pre-modern world saw nature not as an accidental product of geological time, random mutation, and natural selection, but as the definitive work of art, uniquely deserving of imitation. According to Plato's account in the Timaeus, the divine craftsman himself is an imitator, having created the world by imitation of ideal forms. And he did so not for any instrumental purpose, as if he had any need of it, but for its own sake, in an act of benevolence, to serve no other purpose but to manifest the goodness of its creator. By making fine art, whose beauty is an end in itself, the classical artist did what the divine craftsman does, and by improving upon nature in imitation of the ideal, even entered into lively competition with him. Classical art was a reenactment of the story of creation, and so was the art of the Renaissance. Following not only Plato's Timaeus, but also the story of creation in Genesis, the Renaissance painter improved upon classical art by separating the light from the darkness in chiaroscuro, and by separating the heavens from the earth with an horizon line in linear perspective. With particular attention to the human form, the Renaissance painter reenacted the creation of man by making images of the image of God, quite literally from the dust of the earth. When naturalism was abruptly abandoned by the authors of abstraction at the turn of the 20th century, it had everything to do with the loss of belief in God. For all the talk of the spiritual in art, Kandinsky and Mondrian were equivocating atheists, and Malevich was an outspoken one. Abstraction stood at the end of Romanticism's project to discover in nature and in art some ultimate meaning which could no longer be grounded in a transcendent God. The modern artist had lost his prototype, and so he retold the story of creation in the absence of a creator. Modern art became, as it were, a representation of the watery abyss in Genesis. The seminal works of abstraction, such as Malevich's Black Square, are formless and void for want of any spirit of God hovering over the deep, separating the light from the darkness and the heavens from the earth. And while many people find abstraction mystifying, in fact, an abstract painting is exactly what it looks like: a painting of nothing, a sublime, primordial nothingness at the bottom of reality where God used to be. Yet theism is not the only metaphysical assumption implicit in classicism. Classical art would not have needed to be reinvented in the late Middle Ages had the doctrine of creation been sufficient to arrive at a classical concept of art. There was another idea having to do with Aristotelian metaphysics, which had to be rediscovered by scholastic theologians before classical art could be reinvented by Renaissance painters and sculptors. And the key which unlocked the Italian Renaissance was Aristotelian realism, as distinct from Platonic realism. Realism in the generic sense is the idea that things have a nature which can be known. A common sense idea which only a Cartesian skeptic would think to question. Granted a rational intellect and 5 senses, everyone knows that it is the nature of a stone to be hard, the nature of the sky to be blue, or the nature of a human being to walk on 2 legs. From the common sense perspective of Samuel Johnson, who refuted Bishop Berkeley's skepticism by kicking a stone, it is simply absurd to doubt that one has knowledge of the nature of things. How else could artists imitate nature, unless nature were knowable? Nevertheless, philosophers have an irritating habit of questioning the obvious. Plato, for one, was not so sure that artists do imitate nature in the proper sense of the word. He accused painters of not representing things as they really are, but instead painting a soulless imitation of appearances, an imitation of an imitation, 2 steps removed from the ultimate reality of the ideal forms. As far as Plato was concerned, what things really are boils down to a universal nature which is shared in common across things of a kind and determined by the soul. Far from a mysterious homunculus located in the pineal gland, as René Descartes apparently believed, the soul is the form which makes the body the kind of thing that it is. Hence, mimesis may be described as soulless insofar as the mere transcription of outward appearances fails to express the form that makes things what they really are. If painting really did amount to nothing more than handmade photography, it wouldn't amount to very much. Because there is more to reality than the surface of things. For which reason, academic theorists never fail to stress that a painter must do more than imitate appearances. To quote the English theorist Jonathan Richardson, a beautiful painting not only shows us how things appear, but tells us what they are. A fine painting is more true than truth itself, as the French theorist Roger de Pile put it, by which he meant more true to the nature of things than the simple appearance of things. The first solution proposed by theorists to the soullessness of mimesis was idealization. As Sir Joshua Reynolds explains in his discourses, art must improve upon nature by means of an ideal form derived from nature. To the credit of my teachers at the Angel Academy, the constant refrain which was pounded into my head when I was a student was precisely this, that our objective was to paint form and not just to copy what we saw. Because the naive transcription of appearances has no volume, no depth, and no structure. A painter must learn to create such effects by following the principles of chiaroscuro, linear perspective, and anatomical construction, for example. To make a painting look realistic, one must paint an idea of form. Hence the title of Giovanni Bellori's seminal essay on the theory of art, The Idea of the Painter, the Sculptor, and the Architect, which Bellori delivered in a lecture to the Academy of St. Luke in Rome in 1664. Yet, idealization is obviously not what separated Renaissance art from Byzantine art. Platonic realism did not need to be rediscovered in the Renaissance, having been the prevailing wisdom among theologians for the first 1,000 years of Christendom. Rather, the obstacle to classical mimesis was that Platonism favored a highly simplified, formulaic idealization, as in Byzantine iconography. Byzantine art depicts Platonic abstractions, arrived at by reasoning up to ideal forms independent of observation. To motivate the direct observation of nature, medieval artists needed something more than Plato, and that motivation came from Aristotle. Medieval Aristotelianism enlarged Platonism's exclusive emphasis on form by incorporating all four of Aristotle's categories of explanation into the definition of what a thing is. And to distinguish this more expansive idea of the thing in itself from the narrow concept of form, St. Thomas Aquinas referred to it as an essence. Whereas a Platonist would say that the essence of a human being is the human soul, Aquinas replied that a human being is not just an immortal soul, but the union of body and soul in one substance, which explains why Christians place their hope in the resurrection of the body. While the soul makes the body human, the body gives the soul its individuality. The Platonic ideal, conceived merely as a distillation of what things of a kind share in common, is not what is ultimately real, because real souls are individuated. Aristotelian realism completely transformed the way that art was made. If essences are not simply abstractions existing on a transcendental plane of pure thought, but a principle inhering in matter, then it follows that the only way to discover the essence of things is to abstract it out by studying the concrete particular. This is the idea that made Leonardo da Vinci's dissection of the human body conceivable. Indeed, it is this idea of abstracting out the universal from the particular that moved Renaissance art forward along every step of its development. The artist's idea of form could not continue to stagnate once it began to be refreshed and refined by drawing from life. And even as the tradition surpassed the naturalism of antiquity, accumulating an inexhaustible pattern book of sound precedent, life study remained indispensable. Just as the truth of human nature, according to Aristotle, is a union of body and soul, so the truth of art is an elusive union of appearances and the ideal, best exemplified, according to academic authorities, by the works of Raphael. Even though academic training instilled a sufficient understanding of the human form to liberate artists from servile dependency on the model, Joshua Reynolds instructed his students not to imitate François Boucher's deplorable practice of working purely from imagination, but to work so far as possible from life, because their purpose was to paint life. Even the most idealizing of academic painters, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, who often worked without a model, likewise cautioned his students that idealization is an insufficient solution to the soullessness of mimesis, because ideal form has no life unless the deathly perfection of its symmetries is animated by the imperfections of real life. As the principle of life, which not only gives the body its shape, but also animates it, the soul is expressed above all by the movements, gestures, and expressions of the body. Movement is the final answer to Plato's critique, which is why no quality was more highly esteemed by Renaissance connoisseurs. They all agreed that the best paintings are like Michelangelo's frescoes and Titian's Poesie, which depict the human body in lively, expressive action like poetry. In stark contrast to the wall of separation between painting and poetry later erected by the Enlightenment critic Gotthold Lessing, Leon Battista Alberti modeled his theory of painting on Ciceronian rhetoric and instructed painters to do what poets do. According to Aristotle's Poetics, the poet's object of imitation is the action of men. The focus is on man because man is the measure of all things, who stands at the pinnacle of creation and names all things, such that all of creation is contained within him in virtue of his rational intellect. The poet imitates action because what man really is expressed by what he does. The movements of the human soul are not a random, Brownian motion to no particular end, but purposive and meaningful. They tell a story about the nature of reality. Thus, the highest priority of academic painting as an art modeled on poetry was to depict a great story. The preeminent genre in the academic tradition was known as history painting, which is a slightly misleading translation of la storia in Italian, used by Leon Battista Alberti to refer not only to historical subjects, but to any story worthy of the poet's craft. This did not include stories of ordinary life, though the Dutch would beg to differ. History painting, as opposed to genre painting, depicts a story of great deeds, which show by example what it is to be human. The story would not be invented by the painter, though he would exercise his powers of invention by interpreting the story in a novel and ingenious way. Ideas could be repeated, but the movements, the gestures, and the expressions had to be reinvented. It was this appropriation of poetic invention, the first and most important canon of rhetoric, which elevated Renaissance painting from a mere handcraft to the status of a liberal art. Aping imitation of nature may succumb to Plato's critique, but creative imitation, which follows the principles of invention, does not. As the paradigmatic solution to the soullessness of mimesis, history painting stands at the top of the academic hierarchy of genres, while landscape and portraiture fall somewhere in the middle, and at the bottom of the hierarchy is still life, being paradigmatic of the mere transcription of appearances. The omission of still life from my exhibition, as well as the descending scale of my history paintings, portraits, and landscapes, have been calculated to communicate this hierarchy. Thus, the simple-minded notion that art imitates nature was not so simple after all. The principles of academic art had to be discovered on the basis of sound philosophy. It was only by looking through the right philosophical lens that artists began to see nature as it really is. And it was likewise by looking through a distorting philosophical lens that modern and postmodern artists lost the ability to see anything at all. The academic tradition arose atop a foundation laid by medieval Christianity and classical metaphysics, and it was demolished by radical skepticism, not only of the existence of God, but also of metaphysical realism. Modern and postmodern art are the two arms of a single movement. Together, they had one objective: to apply the conclusions of modern philosophy to art, toppling the two pillars of classical art and razing the whole edifice to the ground, as though the academic tradition were the temple of Dagon and the modern artist were Samson Agonistes. John Milton would be so proud. Before the 20th century, only a handful of modern philosophers were so bold as to frankly announce their disbelief in God. But all of the most notable modern philosophers agreed that the objective of classical mimesis, to represent things as they really are in themselves, is impossible. Be they idealists or empiricists, be they John Locke and David Hume, or Immanuel Kant and Arthur Schopenhauer, all modern philosophers rejected metaphysical realism, both of the Platonic and of the Aristotelian variety. Not one of them recognized what consequence this would have for art, but it did not take long for artists themselves to figure out that classical art was doomed if it succumbed by default to Plato's critique of mimesis. When that whereof Wittgenstein could not speak, the noumenon beyond the reach of Kantian reason, the thing in itself, lies beyond the limits of representation, what sense does it make trying to represent it? There is no point in going to so much trouble. It was this purported discovery of the inescapable soullessness of mimesis that called the nature of art into question. At the same time that abstraction was announcing the atheism of the modern world, conceptual art was invented to repudiate metaphysical realism. The thesis announced by Marcel Duchamp's fountain at the annual exhibition of the Society of Independent Artists in the ominous year of 1917 is that art does not have an essential nature anymore. Duchamp's tongue-in-cheek exposition of an upside-down urinal was intended to turn Aristotelian essentialism on its head. Duchamp presented a mass-produced object which he did not make, and he signed it with a name that was not his own, thereby deconstructing the principle of art's efficient causality, that art must be made by an artist. Duchamp deconstructed art's material causality by not using materials proper to painting or sculpture, as well as art's formal causality by not imitating nature, much less in a unique style, to say nothing of art's final causality by making a mockery of beauty. Duchamp deconstructed all that constitutes the essential nature of the work of art. Just as no one is able to say what a woman is anymore, no one is able to say what art is either. There is no such thing as art, proclaimed Marcel Duchamp, but only objects called by that name. Art is whatever the art world says it is. To comprehend the significance of what Duchamp did, consider the works of Rembrandt. Everyone takes for granted that an original Rembrandt is more valuable than a forgery, and that a masterpiece by Rembrandt is more valuable than a sketch by him. Yet both ideas are based on a belief in essentialism, that the works of a master share an immaterial essence, which the forgery lacks and the masterpiece most perfectly expresses. No matter how convincing a 19th century forgery of a Rembrandt might be, the forgery loses all market value should it be found out, because it lacks something essential namely the hand of the master, the efficient cause of a Rembrandt. Even if a forger perfectly replicates the style of Rembrandt, a challenging but not impossible feat, the forgery will still lose all market value should it be discovered under the microscope that anachronistic synthetic pigments have been used, because it lacks the material cause of a Rembrandt. Of those paintings that are autograph originals by Rembrandt, their market value will vary considerably according to quality. The most valuable masterpiece is the one that most faithfully imitates nature in the style of the master, the formal cause of a Rembrandt, and is therefore his most beautiful masterpiece, the final cause of a Rembrandt. Being by the hand of Rembrandt, of materials that Rembrandt used, in the form of Rembrandt's style, and undeniably beautiful, the works of Rembrandt have a nature which can be known and is determined by Aristotle's four causes. Duchamp's upside-down urinal was designed to expose the premise of essentialism implicit in the work of art and to dispel that premise merely by bringing it to consciousness. Leaving it to philosophers to make a cogent argument against immaterial essences, Duchamp made the case rhetorically in an argumentum ad lapidem, by simply ridiculing Aristotelianism as superstitious nonsense. And it worked. Since the 1960s, the art world has been given over to postmodern cynicism. As Andy Warhol announced in 1963, art is dead, and an exhibition has been made of its lifeless remains, of which abstraction is the skeleton and conceptualism the putrefied flesh. This grisly display has been used to collapse objective reality into a flat plane on which to paint a subjective reality. By exhibiting a banana taped to a wall, or marketing a painting by Matisse for millions of dollars, the art world asks rhetorically, why does anything have value? But because one values it. Does value not come from an evaluator? The human will has become the measure of reality, in the mistaken conviction that there is no deeper reality beneath the surface of things, or at least none that can be known. It surfaces all the way down, to quote Stanley Fish. Beauty is not truth, and truth is not beauty, because the transcendent meaning, which John Keats purported to find in a Grecian urn, independent of any transcendent God, was a delusion. As Friedrich Nietzsche predicted, the failure of Romanticism has left postmodern man in despair, not only of ultimate meaning, but of sense and reason. He has lost his wits. The postmodern condition is nothing so highfalutin as skepticism of meta-narrative, but what used to be called insanity. Whatever madness may do for professors, it doesn't do much for artists. As Leon Battista Alberti remarks in his treatise on painting, a painter must clearly understand what he is attempting to do, because he draws the bow in vain who has nowhere to point the arrow. The purpose of the Atelier movement has been to restore the understanding of painting that has been lost. Hundreds of professional artists have now been trained to a very high standard of competence, comparable to, and in many cases exceeding, my own, though there is something other than skill that sets my work apart. The paintings in this exhibition are not typical of contemporary academic art, either stylistically or in terms of subject matter. My paintings are idealized, with close attention to historically precedented styles, and they also depict canonical subjects drawn from classical mythology and Christian iconography. To my knowledge, no one else is doing this, even though this is what academic painting used to be all about. Most of the work coming out of the ateliers is not of a kind which Giorgio Vasari would have recognized as belonging to the academic tradition which he founded. One reason for this is ignorance of good academic theory, and another is the effect of bad theory. Contemporary painting degenerates by default, either into photographic transcriptive naturalism or romantic self-expression, under the persistent sway of the same old revolutionary ideas which overtook the French art world in the 19th century. An enduring effect of the Enlightenment and Romanticism has been to corrupt the popular understanding of art. From the perspective of Enlightenment rationalism, what matters most is a rationalistic concept of form, consisting of whatever can be measured and precisely transcribed from direct observation, as illustrated perhaps by the works of Jean-Léon Gérôme. The question of art's purpose scarcely enters into the rationalistic transcription of appearances as a disinterested scientific enterprise. From the perspective of Romanticism, by contrast, having a purpose matters a great deal, quite irrespective of what purpose that happens to be. For the Romantic, in the footsteps of Eugène Delacroix, what really matters is authenticity, a sincere expression of one's own interior life and subjective experience. In either case, the formal cause of the craft is separated from its final cause. The imitation of nature is divorced from beauty and enters into a custody battle with it. Why should the imitation of nature be beautiful, asked Gustave Courbet, when nature is not always beautiful? Is ugliness not an equally meritorious goal, asked Francisco Goya? Of course, artists of the 19th century were so deeply shaped by the tradition that the effect of corrupting philosophies was merely to add a stylistic flair to their work. The rationalistic style of Jean-Léon Gérôme is still highly admirable because it reflects the most profound understanding of the tradition, and the same concession must be made to Delacroix's romantic self-expression. Today, the situation is entirely different, because there is no sense of the tradition at all. My work is the exception which proves the rule. Ultimately, the great difficulty of restoring the art of painting is that classical art proceeds from and sets up a world which is not our own. It expresses a worldview which contemporary artists do not have, myself included at one point in time. When I arrived in Italy in 2006, I knew that there was something wrong with putting an upside-down urinal on display in a museum and calling it art, but I couldn't say what precisely. I had no idea of the philosophical premises of modern and postmodern art, much less did I realize to what extent I took the same erroneous beliefs for granted. All I knew was that I didn't care for the postmodern art world, and I was on the lookout for an alternative. Upon encountering Renaissance Italy, I found a world more to my liking, and so I decided to try it on for size. My education instilled a natural desire to do what artists of the Italian Renaissance had done, being the most natural use of the skills I had acquired. Finding Enlightenment rationalism absurd and romantic individualism paralyzing, I looked to the tradition from which my skills derived to give me an ideal at which to aim. I wanted to paint the Holy Family and the Pietà because Correggio had painted them. I wanted to paint Bacchus and Ariadne and Venus and Adonis because Titian had done so. Nothing I might have contrived could rise to a higher standard of spiritual or historical seriousness than canonical subject matter, and so I confined myself to the canon. It was all perfectly logical. The fact that I was not a medieval Catholic or a Renaissance humanist did not deter me, because I did not intend to impose my amorphous individuality on the tradition, but to find my identity as an artist by embodying the tradition. I was not interested in expressing my own point of view, but sought rather to understand how Renaissance artists saw reality, because I found their vision compelling. It was by turning to the primary sources, such as Alberti's treatise on painting and Joshua Reynolds' discourses, that I discovered the deceptively simple objective of painting, to show what things really are. And I also had to read some philosophy to figure out what this had to do with beauty, which turned out to be perfectly intuitive. The identification of beauty with truth is actually implicit in the way that we speak of it. When do we call a thing beautiful, but when it shows itself for what it really is? As when a flower blossoms. When is a woman most beautiful, but when she becomes a woman? When is the sun most beautiful, but when it rises? When is a local color most beautiful, but when it is clear and bright? Beauty is the name of truth's appearance. Beauty is what truth looks like. And to express this idea, I follow the advice of Sir Joshua Reynolds by using simple, bold local colors after the grand manner of the Florentine and Roman school of Renaissance painting, as opposed to the more complex local colors and subtle textures of the Venetian school, while my portraits and landscapes focus on the simplest, most paradigmatic examples of beauty, be it a sunrise or a young woman with a rose in her hair. Although the rationalistic imitation of appearances is often at odds with beauty, the imitation of nature never is, because beauty reveals the true nature of things. Beauty is the revelation of what things really are. In other words, beauty is an unveiling, which does explain the paramount significance of the unveiling of the human body in classical art. The importance of the nude to the academic tradition cannot be overstated, considering that the overwhelming majority of an academic artist education would be spent learning how to draw the human figure. The classical nude answers Plato's critique of mimesis, insofar as the unveiling of the human body unveils something more than the body, the invisible and immaterial human soul, which revelation forestalls the appetitive inclination to objectify the body. The classical nude has always been suspected of moral turpitude, but in fact it is surprisingly contemplative. Rather than excite the appetites, the classical nude mortifies them, as Arthur Schopenhauer observed, because its beauty is a purely intellectual pleasure. As a representation of the essential goodness of human nature as it was originally created, the classical nude is unfallen, and it invites one to experience the same prolapsarian innocence vicariously. To make this point as clearly as possible, I make use of the nude only in the context of mythological and allegorical subject matter, which demands a heightened idealization of the figure, setting it at a sufficient remove from everyday experience. All of my stylistic choices are motivated by historical precedent as opposed to subjective taste, because academic conventions and hierarchies provide the most reliable means of arriving at the objective properties of beauty. Contrary to the teaching of the Enlightenment, which reduced beauty to a matter of subjective aesthetic pleasure, the beauty of a painting obviously depends upon objective properties. A beautiful sight is often described using words like captivating or enthralling, both metaphors of bondage, because beauty is an experience of subjection to a power outside oneself. To see a beautiful painting is to become subject to it. The object acts upon you, and it changes you. The object takes hold and conforms the soul to itself. Beauty is the action of an object disclosing itself to a subject, the action of one being revealing itself to another being, and therefore a revelation of the transcendental properties of being, namely unity, goodness, and truth. A painter captures these three properties using three tools of drawing, composition, and color as defined by Alberti. Even though there are no lines in nature, a painter expresses the unity of things by circumscribing each figure with contour lines to show its discrete corporeal integrity. A painter then uses the rules of composition to unify a painting's diverse parts, weaving the lines seamlessly together, harmonizing the local colors, unifying the shadows, and massing similar tones. A painter expresses the property of goodness by hitting the mark. Good drawing accurately represents the proportions of things, and a good composition has a proportionality within itself. Each part fits in relation to the whole in lively symmetry. Some parts come forward and others recede, creating a hierarchy of emphasis. Lastly, a painter expresses the truth of things by capturing their characteristic form in a convincing likeness. And he thereby expresses the truth of art, crowning a painting with a resplendence analogous to the gilded background of a Byzantine icon, but consisting instead of an overall clarity of form which makes a painting cohere at a glance. Hence, the objective properties of beauty, as derived by St. Thomas Aquinas from the properties of being, are integrity, proportion, and clarity. Straightforward as these properties are to describe, they are not so easy to achieve. It is difficult to make a beautiful painting, because it is difficult to show what things really are. Modern philosophers had reasons to be skeptical of metaphysical realism, for as Aquinas once said, the efforts of human thought cannot so much as plumb the essence of a single gnat. What art reveals of the essence of things has the character of an analogy. Art is merely a likeness of the thing in itself, but when the likeness is good, it amounts to a veritable miracle. Good art opens the eyes of the blind. Everyone needs art because everyone forgets how to see. Reality really does disappear behind a veil of appearances. The world is so obscured by familiarity and thoughtless instrumentality that in time one ceases to see anything at all except what one already knows. Who needs eyes when one has knowledge? Who needs taste when reality has been pre-digested? Who needs ears to hear oneself speak? Fine art awakens dormant senses. By representing reality on canvas or panel, a painting calls attention to all that one has learned to ignore. A painter studies what others take for granted. He looks, and then he looks again, not simply imposing his preconceptions upon nature, but allowing nature to be a model of itself and abstracting out an intelligible form from it. Some paintings are better than others, because they do a better job of showing what things really are. The work of art is most beautiful when it shows what art really is, as an imitation of nature. Seneca the Elder said it best, all art is an imitation of nature. For 100 years, this simple truth has been obfuscated by powerful institutions, moneyed interests, and intellectual fraud. Yet all the propaganda in the world has not silenced and cannot silence the testimony of fine art, whose beauty still attests to an objective reality which can be known and to which we must conform ourselves, because refusing to do so can only end in folly and human misery. Even today, the most beautiful art continues to show us exactly what real art looks like. To make real art again, an artist does not have to be an ancient Athenian, a medieval Catholic, or a Renaissance humanist, or even a classical academician. But one does have to be a realist, because anyone who denies that there is a target cannot possibly hit the target. It is clear what artists need to do, though hardly anyone is doing it considering the price to be paid for it. One must go into exile, because real art has no home in the contemporary art world. Yet rightly considered, this homelessness is no cause for misery, but a calling to artists to set up another world. To rebuild the world that we have lost, artists have only to do what artists have always done. I just paint what artists used to paint. I think the way that artists used to think. I inhabit the very same world which Renaissance artists inhabited, and so it is only natural for me to paint like them. I have nothing more to give than what I have received. My pictorial inventions reflect my personal rediscovery of a reality which has never really left us, truths which have not changed because they cannot change. Art is not just a name. Art has a nature which can be known. Taking leave of Duchamp's upside-down urinal and returning to the twofold origin of nature and tradition, I go to the true source and fountain with confidence that art will rise again from the waters.